Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful and heartfelt tales that inspire, challenge, and move you. Today, we dive into the emotional journey of Rebecca, a devoted mother and wife whose seemingly perfect life is shattered by unexpected betrayal. Through resilience, love, and unwavering strength, she navigates heartbreak to rebuild her world for the sake of her son, Ethan. This is a story of courage, healing, and the profound lessons life has to offer. Subscribe to our channel and join us as we begin today's story. Life Stories starts now. My name is Rebecca, and my life, at first glance, may seem like a whirlwind of responsibility, but to me, it's a rhythm that feels almost natural. Each morning begins in a small but cozy house in Elmwood, a quiet suburb where the air is always crisp and fresh, and the chatter of birds heralds the dawn. This particular morning was no different. As I tied back my shoulder-length chestnut hair in the bathroom mirror, I caught myself smiling. Never forget to smile. Even when you're busy, my mother used to say. She was right. Of course. Smiling doesn't just lift your mood, it keeps the wheels turning when life feels like an endless cycle of obligations. My phone's screen read 6:30 a.m. And as I placed it on the kitchen counter, I mentally mapped out my morning. My shift at St. Clair Memorial Hospital started at 8 a.m., which left just enough time to prepare breakfast and lunch for my son, Ethan, and make sure my husband, David, was ready for his day. Ethan's voice carried through the hallway, bright and full of life as always. "Mom, did you wash my soccer uniform?" he called from the living room. "Yes, Ethan," I replied, laughing as I heard his bare feet thump against the floor in excitement. "It's folded and ready." Ethan was my pride and joy. At 8 years old, he was already a force of energy, brimming with enthusiasm for soccer, school, and whatever else life had to offer. His bright personality had made him the center of attention among his classmates. And while his father's late work hours sometimes weighed on his mind, he always found a way to cheer me up instead. A few moments later, David appeared in the kitchen, freshly showered, his dark hair still damp. He kissed me on the cheek, a ritual we had shared since the early days of our marriage. Yet, something about it felt different lately, more routine than intimate. David worked as a middle manager at a tech company downtown. His life, much like mine, was carefully structured and efficient. People often remarked on how similar we were, both meticulous and detail-oriented. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, David had always been indecisive when it came to big decisions, a quality that sometimes worried me. As I laid out breakfast, whole wheat toast, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, and a salad of organic vegetables, I noticed David scrolling through his phone again. It had become a habit of his, one I tried to ignore, convincing myself it was just work. "Do you have a lot on your plate today?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Just the usual," he said, not looking up. "I'll be heading out early." Ethan bounded into the room, dressed and ready for school, his face lit with excitement. "Mom, you're coming to my practice game today, right?" "Of course," I said, ruffling his hair. "I'm finishing early so I can pick you up." His grin stretched from ear to ear as he dug into his plate of pancakes, the maple syrup glistening in the morning light. Moments like these reminded me why I worked so hard to create a stable, happy home for Ethan. Despite our busy schedules, we made time for the little things. Weekends often found us strolling along Greenfield Park or having picnics by the river. Ethan loved action movies, and though David and I leaned toward romantic comedies, we never minded his enthusiastic commentary during family movie nights. Our neighbor Mary, a warm-hearted woman in her 60s, often joined us. She had been like a second grandmother to Ethan, bringing over homemade pies and teaching him the names of flowers in her garden. But as much as I treasured these moments, a sense of unease had started to creep in. David seemed distracted more often, his attention absorbed by his phone or distant thoughts. He still kissed me goodbye each morning and hugged Ethan after work. But something intangible had shifted. As I stood in the kitchen that morning, watching him gather his things and head for the door, I tried to shake the feeling. Maybe I was imagining it. After all, we'd been married for 10 years. It was normal for routines to settle in, for excitement to ebb and flow. "I'll see you tonight," he said, briefly touching my shoulder before stepping out. When the door clicked shut, the house felt quieter. Ethan's chatter filled the silence as he finished his breakfast. But my mind wandered. Was it just the stress of work getting to David? Or was there something more? By the time I dropped Ethan off at school and made my way to the hospital, I had pushed those thoughts aside. St. Clair Memorial was bustling as usual. The corridors alive with the hum of patients, nurses, and doctors. I slipped into my white coat and joined the morning meeting in the pharmacy department. Flu season had hit hard, and our team was swamped with prescriptions and patient consultations. Even lunch, a rare moment of reprieve, was a hurried affair. My colleague Sarah, ever observant, noticed my distracted demeanor. "Everything okay, Rebecca?" she asked as we unpacked our sandwiches in the break room. "Just a bit tired," I replied, offering a small smile. She studied me for a moment but didn't press further. The afternoon flew by in a blur of inventory checks, prescription verifications, and patient counseling. By the time my shift ended at 5:30 p.m., I was physically drained but mentally preoccupied. David's rushed departure that morning, his increasingly late nights, and his quiet demeanor weighed on my mind. As I drove to Ethan's soccer practice, the rain began to fall, the windshield wipers rhythmically slicing through the grey drizzle. Arriving at the field, I was greeted by the sight of Ethan and his teammates, their red uniforms bright against the dreary backdrop. Watching him play, his energy and joy unrestrained, brought a warmth to my heart that the weather couldn't dampen. "Hey, Mom, did you see my shot?" Ethan asked excitedly as he climbed into the car after practice. "You did great," I said, smiling at him in the rearview mirror. "Can we have pizza tonight?" he asked, his eyes lighting up at the thought. "Pizza it is," I replied, glad to see him so happy. But as we pulled into the parking lot of our apartment building, the rain now a steady downpour, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The flickering hallway light seemed unusually ominous. And Ethan, leaning against my arm as we walked, felt heavier than usual. Little did I know, as I pressed the elevator button, that the ordinary rhythm of my life was about to be shattered. Something was waiting for us just beyond that door, something that would change everything. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, though it was only 3 floors. Ethan leaned against my arm, tired from practice, his soccer cleats dangling from his backpack. The quiet hum of the elevator mixed with the distant patter of rain against the building's windows. When the elevator doors slid open, I stepped into the hallway, immediately noticing how dimly lit it was. A single fluorescent light flickered above, casting an unsettling glow. The sound of rain outside was muffled, but the atmosphere felt heavy. Ethan held my hand tightly as we walked toward our apartment. "Mom, why's it so quiet?" Ethan whispered. I opened my mouth to reassure him, but before I could speak, a voice startled us. "Rebecca." I turned to see Mary, our neighbor from across the hall, rushing out of her apartment. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced with urgency. She wore a light cardigan over her nightgown, her hands trembling as she grabbed my arm. "Don't go in there," she said, her voice hoarse and shaky. "Something terrible is happening." My breath caught in my throat. "Mary, what are you talking about?" Before she could answer, a loud crash echoed from behind my apartment door. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, followed by the faint murmur of raised voices. "Mom!" Ethan's voice quivered as he clutched my sleeve. Another sound erupted, sharp and piercing, like a gunshot or glass breaking. A woman's scream followed, chilling and raw. My body froze as adrenaline surged through me. Mary didn't wait for me to react. She pulled Ethan and me into her apartment, slamming the door shut behind us. "Stay here," she said firmly, locking the door. Ethan clung to me, his small hands trembling. My mind raced with questions. What was going on? Who was in my apartment? And why? "I need to call the police," I said, fumbling for my phone. My fingers shook as I unlocked the screen and dialed 911. 911, "What's your emergency?" a calm voice answered. "There's something happening in my apartment," I said, my voice breaking. I heard a loud noise. It sounded like a gunshot, and someone screamed, "Please send help. It's Riverside Gardens. Apartment 304. The operator reassured me that officers were on their way. Meanwhile, intermittent noises continued to emanate from my apartment, muffled shouts, the sound of objects being thrown, and another crash. Mary, who had always been a source of warmth and comfort, now exuded quiet strength. She gently guided Ethan to the sofa, wrapping a blanket around him. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice soothing. "The police will be here soon." Ethan buried his face in the crook of my arm, his body trembling. I stroked his hair, trying to calm him, but my own fear threatened to overwhelm me. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. The rain outside intensified, its steady rhythm against the windows a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding nearby. Mary busied herself by making tea, her hands steady despite the tension in the air. She placed a cup in front of me, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the silence. Blue and red lights reflected off the rain-soaked street below. A flurry of activity followed as police officers stormed into the building. We remained huddled in Mary's apartment, the muffled sounds of officers shouting and the crackle of their radios filtering through the walls. My heart raced as I imagined what they might find behind my apartment door. A knock at Mary's door jolted me out of my thoughts. When she opened it, two officers stepped inside, a middle-aged man with a calm, authoritative presence and a younger woman with sharp, observant eyes. The male officer addressed Mary. "May we use your window to observe the scene?" Mary nodded, retrieving an old telescope from her closet. "It was my late husband's," she explained softly. The young officer set up the telescope and began surveying the apartment across the hall. Meanwhile, the male officer turned to me. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "is there anyone else who might be in your apartment?" "My husband, David," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But he should still be at work. And my sister, Samantha, she sometimes stops by. But I didn't expect her tonight." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. The young officer spoke into her radio, her tone clipped and professional. "We need to wait for the tactical unit to arrive. The situation is active." As we waited, the younger officer continued to monitor the scene through the telescope. "There are two individuals," she said. "A woman, seated but not moving much, and a man, he appears to be holding a phone." Ethan, though calmer now, flinched at every sound. I held his hand tightly, his warmth grounding me in the moment. When the tactical unit finally moved in, the hallway filled with the sound of boots, commands, and the sharp crack of my apartment door being forced open. My body tensed as I listened, the seconds dragging by. Eventually, the older officer returned to Mary's apartment. His expression was grave but controlled. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "we've secured the scene. Both individuals are alive. But the situation is complicated. We'll need you to come with us to provide some context." I glanced at Mary, who gave me an encouraging nod. Ethan clung to her as I reluctantly followed the officer across the hall. When I stepped into my apartment, the sight before me was almost unrecognizable. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, papers scattered, and shards of a broken vase littering the floor. In the corner, David stood, his face pale and his hands trembling. Nearby, Samantha sat on the floor, clutching her head, a small trail of blood running down her temple. She looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Rebecca," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond. My world had just turned upside down, and the answers I sought would soon reveal truths I wasn't sure I was ready to face. As I stood in the doorway of my apartment, it felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The chaos in front of me was surreal, almost cinematic. David's trembling figure and Samantha's tear-streaked face anchored me in the harsh reality that this was no scene from a drama, it was my life unraveling. "Mrs. Carter, please step inside," the officer urged gently, guiding me past the threshold. The shattered pieces of my life lay scattered across the floor, both literally and figuratively. David looked up, his eyes meeting mine. They were filled with a mix of guilt, fear, and something that resembled regret. "Rebecca," he said, his voice hoarse, "I can explain." But I wasn't ready for explanations, not yet. My gaze shifted to Samantha, who clutched her head and avoided eye contact. She looked disheveled, her usually polished appearance replaced with one of vulnerability and defeat. "Mrs. Carter," the officer interrupted, pulling me back to the moment. "We need you to confirm a few things." I nodded, forcing myself to focus. The senior detective placed several clear evidence bags on the table, their contents illuminated under the harsh light of the room. Among them were a bundle of receipts, a smashed smartphone, and what appeared to be handwritten notes. "This might be difficult to process," the detective warned, his tone steady but sympathetic. "We've pieced together a rough timeline based on what we've observed and the items collected here. Your husband and your sister have been involved in financial transactions and personal dealings." My stomach churned as I processed his words. Financial transactions? Personal dealings? The room seemed to blur as I struggled to wrap my mind around what he was implying. "Please, explain." I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The detective began to outline the situation, each word striking me like a hammer. "It started 3 months ago, shortly after Samantha's divorce. Financially desperate and emotionally unstable, Samantha had turned to David for support. What began as a few instances of financial aid escalated into something far more complex and far more damaging. She demanded money," the detective explained, gesturing to the receipts. "Luxury hotels, restaurants, cash deposits. The total amount exceeds $200,000. I stared at the receipts, the evidence staring back at me with cold, unforgiving clarity. Each date and amount felt like a betrayal etched in ink. Samantha was threatening to expose their relationship, the detective continued, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation. "Tonight, she brought a replica gun and demanded $50,000. When your husband refused, the situation escalated." "A replica gun?" I repeated, the words foreign and absurd in my mouth. The detective nodded. "Though it wasn't a real weapon, the intent behind the threat was clear." That's when the struggle began, leading to the chaos we found here. I looked at Samantha, who was now being attended to by a paramedic. She seemed small, fragile even, as if the weight of her actions had drained her of all strength. My attention shifted to David. His eyes pleaded with me, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The man I had trusted, the father of my child, had been complicit in this web of deceit. "Mrs. Carter," the detective said, drawing my focus back to him. "Do you recognize these?" He held up a few photographs encased in plastic sleeves. I stepped closer and peered at the images. They depicted David and Samantha together at restaurants, in hotel lobbies, even on weekend trips. Each photo felt like a stab to the heart. I don't understand," I stammered, though the truth was becoming all too clear. "The relationship may not have started with malicious intent," the detective said gently, "but it spiraled into something toxic and damaging for everyone involved." I turned away, Unable to look at the evidence any longer, my mind raced, searching for a reason, an explanation that could make sense of this madness. But nothing came. "Rebecca," David finally said, stepping forward hesitantly. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." His words, though filled with regret, only fueled my anger. "You never meant for it to go this far?" I echoed, my voice rising. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? To Ethan?" David flinched but said nothing. Before I could continue, Samantha spoke for the first time. "Rebecca," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't want it to end like this. I was desperate. I made mistakes." "But..." "Mistakes?" I interrupted, turning to face her. "You betrayed me. You both did. How am I supposed to forgive that?" Tears streamed down her face as she tried to respond. But no words came. The detective intervened once more. "Mrs. Carter, we understand this is an incredibly difficult situation. Samantha will be taken to the hospital for further evaluation. And we'll continue our investigation. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out." I nodded mechanically, feeling like a stranger in my own life. The officers began to clear the scene, their voices fading into the background. As Samantha was escorted out, she glanced at me one last time. Her eyes were filled with sorrow and something that resembled guilt. But I couldn't bring myself to offer her comfort. David stood silently by the window, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time since the incident began, the weight of his choices seemed to fully register. I turned to leave, needing air, space, anything to escape the suffocating reality of what had just unfolded. Ethan was waiting for me at Mary's apartment, his innocent world still intact. For his sake, I knew I had to be strong. But as I stepped into the hallway, the tears I had been holding back finally began to fall. My world, once so carefully balanced, had been shattered, and I wasn't sure how to piece it back together. As the rain finally stopped and the evening sun peeked through the clouds, I stood by the window of our new apartment, watching Ethan play soccer in the park below. Life had changed irrevocably in just a few short weeks. But with every passing day, I found the strength to rebuild. Piece by piece, David and I were no longer together, but we remained civil for Ethan's sake. Samantha, though still under psychiatric care, was receiving the help she desperately needed. Forgiveness would take time, but I held on to the hope that one day, we could all heal in our own ways. Looking in the mirror each morning, I no longer saw a woman overwhelmed by betrayal but someone growing stronger, more resilient. The pain was still there, but so was the determination to move forward for myself and for Ethan. As I stepped into the kitchen to prepare dinner, Ethan's laughter filled the room, reminding me that, despite everything, life goes on, and in its quiet, unassuming way, it teaches us how to endure, how to love, and how to hope. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt tales. Thank you for watching.